My paper revisits the role of UNHCR in global refugee policy during the first half of its history. In using this case study, I explore some of the core themes of this workshop, in particular, the Office's use of agency, influence, and power in the making of global refugee policy during its formative years. No UN agency has had such an inauspicious beginning. When the Office was established in 1950, it had a minuscule budget, was restricted to providing legal protection to refugees, and faced stiff competition from other international and national organizations whose programs were generously funded by the United States. Yet within a few years, the Office overcame these restrictions, initiated assistance through NGOs to long-standing refugee groups in Europe, involved itself in an early Cold War refugee crisis in Berlin, and in 1956 the Office was appointed the lead agency in the international response to the major refugee crisis in Hungary. From that time on, UNHCR, under strong, assertive High Commissioners, exerted agency, influence, and occasionally power to help shape and direct global refugee policy. The Office emerged as a significant norm entrepreneur and expanded the scope of the refugee regime from its Eurocentric origins to cover the entire globe by the late 1970s. The workshop paper presented by James yesterday outlined the importance of understanding power and power and influence in the global refugee regime. The early history of UNHCR contains many examples. How and when could we observe UNHCR's influence? From the mid-1950s on, UNHCR's growing agency and autonomy were clear as it was able to act more independently and was less reliant on powerful state actors. With the establishment of its own executive committee of member states, the support of the early UN Secretary Generals and the UN General Assembly, as well as the use of UN Good Office resolutions to expand its operations beyond Europe, UNHCR was able to engage a broader set of actors and to enlarge its role and influence in global refugee policy. Early High Commissioners were norm entrepreneurs who sought to influence and shape state practices and to define what constituted acceptable and legitimate state behavior regarding the treatment of refugees. UNHCR sought to convince states to define their national interests in ways compatible with refugee needs. The Office not only acted as a transmitter and monitor of refugee norms, but from the 1960s on, also socialized new states to accept the promotion of refugee norms domestically as part of becoming a member of the international community. Consequently, through a mixture of persuasion and socialization, the Office acquired considerable legitimacy and authority in the eyes of most new states. At the same time, during these early decades, UNHCR experienced few of the kinds of asylum problems in the industrialized states that would confront the Office in later years. Most governments acknowledged that the Office's Protection Division enjoyed unrivaled specialized knowledge and expertise concerning refugees and asylum law, and deferred to the Office's authority on asylum policy. With a few notable exceptions, the Office played an active role in the refugee determination procedures of several industrialized states, and exerted a considerable influence over government decisions. Hence, UNHCR's autonomy was enhanced, and most governments in Western Europe demonstrated a generally liberal attitude towards asylum seekers. While UNHCR was proactive on most refugee issues during this period, the difference between agency, autonomy, influence, and power in UNHCR policy are sometimes difficult to discern. In particular, can we say that the Office ever exercised power over other actors, particularly powerful states, during this early period? In my paper, I discussed the decision of the Second High Commissioner, August Lind, to press ahead with assisting Algerian refugees in Tunisia against the wishes of the French government. This was the first occasion in which UNHCR emergency assistance was requested in the developing world. Thus, it marked an important step in the development both of the political conditions under which the office had to act and of the functions and activities it was permitted to perform. However, the decision to offer assistance to Algerian refugees was politically difficult and engendered an intense debate within UNHCR about the future role in the developing world. Some of its senior advisors felt that the office should remain focused on finding solutions for the refugees caught in protracted exile in Europe. The High Commissioner, on the other hand, argued that the Tunisian request presented an opportunity for UNHCR to confirm its position both as the leading international refugee agency and as the only international organization able to adapt to new emergencies wherever they arose. Lind feared that UNHCR would be accused of discriminatory treatment if it neglected the Tunisian request, and he did not want to be perceived as the High Commissioner for European Refugees only. He maintained that UNHCR's mandate, as defined in its statute, was worldwide, and that his office had responsibility for dealing with completely different people and not only refugees from communism. He was concerned that to refuse assistance to Tunisia would estrange the organization from a growing bloc of developing nations. The decision to aid Algerian refugees was not easy, however. The High Commissioner had to overcome strong opposition from France, one of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council and one of the founding states of UNHCR. The French government claimed that Algeria was an integral part of the state of France and that the eventual solution could only be the return to Algeria of the people who had taken refuge in Tunisia and Morocco. France also feared UNHCR involvement would internationalize the crisis. Moreover, major Western governments were unwilling to oppose the French. Thus, only through persistent and courageous diplomacy by the High Commissioner with France and other major governments was French resistance to UNHCR involvement overcome. This is, perhaps, the clearest example of UNHCR's exercise of power in its early history. The role of individuals and the role of leadership in international organizations are little studied in international relations. The role of individuals in UNHCR, and especially the strong leadership from the first 4 High Commissioners, were essential to the office's success and influence during the first half of its history. Van Hoven Gerthaert was a leader in the Dutch resistance during World War II. He was the delegate from Netherlands to the 4th and 5th sessions of the UN General Assembly. Very importantly, he chaired the 3rd Committee which created UNHCR. He was elected High Commissioner despite strong US opposition, and he was strongly committed to human rights and refugee causes. August Lindt, Swiss ambassador, he was before becoming High Commissioner, he was Swiss ambassador to the UN in New York. He was a personal friend of the Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General at the time, on good terms with the United States. He was pragmatic and a skilled diplomat. He had a strong personality and determined approach to difficult problems. His successor, Felix Schneider, had, like Lindt, been the Swiss ambassador to the UN in New York before becoming High Commissioner. This was a moment of transition at the United Nations and the rapid growth of new member states. He had close personal relations with delegates from Africa, and under the High Commissionership of August Lindt, Felix Schneider had chaired the ExCom. Finally, Sadruddin Aga Khan was an internationalist with a high profile had a strong connection with the Ismaili community. He had been Deputy High Commissioner under Felix Nieder since 1960. He pursued a similar path of expansion as his predecessors. What were then the sources of influence of these four High Commissioners? Most importantly, I think, all of them had a UN political background, which increased the likelihood that they would be more successful, particularly since the office relied on the strong support of the UN Secretary General and the UN General Assembly and its resolutions to respond to refugee crises during this early period. This is not the case during the second half of UNHCR history, when states mostly appointed High Commissioners who had been involved in state politics. Also important during this early decades is the fact that UNHCR had a monopoly on legal expertise, legitimacy, and influence, and possessed a strong institutional culture supported by a tradition of mentorship of junior staff by senior staff members. When UNHCR was created, the entire legal unit at the International Refugee Organization moved to UNHCR and formed the office's Legal Protection Division. Paul Weiss, Jacques Colmar, and others had unparalleled expertise. States did not have this expertise at the time, and neither did ISIN. This is not the case today. Many states have their own legal expertise and have their own networks to counter UNHCR and to create alternative policies and alternative alliances. In conclusion, the period covered in my paper was a time when UNHCR was at its weakest in terms of material power and physical capabilities. Yet this was a period when the office exercised influence and even power in selected circumstances over states and other actors in the international system. UNHCR and states have been too quick to forget this remarkable early history of the office and have not recognized the need to revisit the period for guidance. During the first half of UNHCR's history, the office demonstrated the importance of a strong foundation of international norms and of effective and innovative leadership from individual High Commissioners. In navigating the Cold War and the period of decolonization and conflict in the developing world, UNHCR had confidence in its strategic purpose and was aware of the changing global political context, as well as the particular impact of their decisions upon the office's response to displacement in the developing world. The office today is confronted with a radically changed world from the one it first entered into in the early 1950s, and faces new and emerging challenges, including migration, urbanization, state failure and fragility, climate change, and redefining the protection and assistance environment in which it works. Institutionally, it faces an ever more dense global environment in which a range of other international and regional organizations potentially compete with UNHCR and enable states to bypass the office in addressing their concerns regarding asylum and migration. Politically, in both the global north and global south, protection and asylum space are diminishing, and UNHCR faces the challenge on how to reinvigorate states' commitment to refugees and other displaced populations. In recent years, the emergence of a more fragmented international politics with several power centers have put new pressures on the previous international consensus of rules and norms governing state behavior and the roles of international organizations. In responding to these problems and developments, UNHCR can learn important lessons from its protection-focused, assertive, and strategic early history, and develop the capacity to address current and future challenges by strengthening its capability to engage in new policy fields, building new partnerships within and beyond the UN system, and engaging strategically with the changing political context within which it works.